The scream that pierced the Easter twilight at Riverside Manor on April 10, 1859, wasn't the joyful cry of children hunting eggs in the garden. It was the agonized wail of 8-year-old Adelaide Thornfield as she watched her grandfather convulse across the mahogany dining table, his weathered hands clawing at his throat while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. In the grand dining hall where 4 generations of Alabama's most powerful cotton dynasty had gathered to celebrate Christ's resurrection, 17 family members now lay dying in chairs that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier, imported from France, still caught the dying sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting rainbow patterns across Persian rugs now stained with vomit and blood. The Easter ham, glazed with honey from the plantation's own hives, sat untouched as the centerpiece of a feast that had become a funeral. By nightfall, the Mobile Register would report the most shocking mass poisoning in Alabama history. But the newspapers would never print the real story of how it happened, or why a woman named Rosa Williams had decided that this particular Easter Sunday would be Judgment Day for the family that owned her soul. The truth behind what happened at Riverside Manor that April evening doesn't begin in the elegant dining room where Mobile's elite came to die. It begins in the sweltering kitchen house, where the wooden floors were stained with decades of spilled grease and tears, and where a 35-year-old woman named Rosa Williams had spent the last 18 years of her life cooking meals for people who considered her less human than their hunting dogs. Rosa had calloused hands that never stopped moving, dark eyes that had learned to see everything while appearing to notice nothing, and a mind sharp enough to remember every cruelty, every humiliation, every threat whispered over her children's sleeping heads. The kitchen house at Riverside Manor stood separate from the main residence, connected by a covered walkway that allowed the White family to enjoy Rosa's cooking without acknowledging her existence. The building itself was a testament to the peculiar contradictions of Southern aristocracy. Inside, copper pots worth more than a year's wages for a white laborer hung alongside cast-iron skillets blackened by countless fires. Imported spices from Charleston filled glass jars that sat next to earthenware crocks made by plantation slaves. French cookbooks with pages stained by Rosa's fingerprints lay open beside recipes passed down through generations of enslaved women who had learned to transform scraps into delicacies that graced the tables of governors and senators. Rosa moved through this space with the fluid efficiency of someone who had mastered every inch of her domain. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows caught the morning breeze, where shadows fell during different hours of the day. She knew the temperament of each cast-iron pot, the precise timing needed for perfect cornbread, the delicate balance of spices that made her famous throughout Mobile County. Most importantly, she knew that her skill in this kitchen was the only thing keeping her family together, the only barrier between her children and the sugar plantations down south where enslaved people disappeared into the cane fields and never returned. The Thornfield family had owned Riverside Manor for 3 generations, building their fortune on cotton and on the backs of human beings they bought and sold like livestock. Elias Thornfield, now 78 years old and confined to a wheelchair, had established the plantation in 1820 with money inherited from his father's shipping business. He had chosen the location carefully, purchasing 2,000 acres along the Mobile River where the rich black soil could produce cotton and the water access allowed direct shipping to ports around the world. By 1840, Riverside Manor was one of the most profitable plantations in Alabama, generating wealth that allowed the Thornfields to build a Greek Revival mansion that rivaled anything in Savannah or Charleston. Marcus Thornfield, Elias's son and current master of the plantation, had inherited both his father's business acumen and his casual cruelty toward the people he enslaved. At 52, Marcus was a man who prided himself on being a progressive planter, someone who fed his slaves adequately and provided medical care when they fell ill. He liked to tell visitors that he treated his people well, that they were happy and loyal, that the institution of slavery was beneficial for both races when managed with Christian charity. What he didn't mention was his habit of selling children away from their mothers when he needed quick cash, or his willingness to use the whip when productivity declined during cotton season. Marcus's wife Vivian had come from an old Savannah family that had lost most of their money in failed rice plantations. She had married Marcus not for love, but for financial security, bringing with her a refined sense of social hierarchy and an obsession with maintaining appearances that exceeded even her husband's natural arrogance. Vivian was the kind of woman who insisted that house slaves wear clean uniforms while she criticized every detail of their work, who complained about the cost of feeding enslaved families while spending more on a single dress than those families would see in a year. The third generation consisted of 3 siblings who represented different approaches to the wealth and power they had inherited. Benjamin, the eldest at 28, managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation with ruthless efficiency. He had studied agriculture at the University of Alabama and considered himself a modern planter, someone who applied scientific methods to maximize cotton production. Benjamin was the family member Rosa feared most, not because he was openly violent, but because he viewed enslaved people as equipment to be optimized, rather than human beings to be considered. When he calculated the costs of feeding, housing, and clothing the plantation's workforce, he did so with the same detachment he applied to determining when to replace worn-out machinery. Catherine Thornfield Webb, 26 years old and recently married to a planter from the neighboring county, represented the social aspirations of the family. She had been educated at a finishing school in Richmond and spoke French fluently, played piano beautifully, and could discuss literature and politics with the sophistication expected of a Southern lady. Catherine visited Riverside Manor frequently, often bringing her 2 young children to stay for extended periods while her husband managed his own plantation. She treated enslaved people with the kind of condescending kindness that was somehow more insulting than open hostility, speaking to them in a baby voice and expressing surprise when they demonstrated intelligence or skill. Samuel, the youngest Thornfield at 24, was studying law in Montgomery with plans to enter politics. He was the family member most influenced by the growing tensions between North and South, and he spent his visits home lecturing anyone who would listen about the constitutional right to own slaves and the economic necessity of the institution. Samuel saw himself as a defender of Southern civilization, someone who would help preserve their way of life against Northern aggression. He had already given speeches at political rallies where he argued that enslaved people were naturally suited for bondage and that freeing them would be an act of cruelty. The 4th generation, the children who would die at that Easter table, represented the future that the Thornfield family was fighting to preserve. Adelaide and James were Benjamin's children, bright and curious 8- and 6-year-olds who had been raised to see enslaved people as part of
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
the natural order of their world. Margaret and Thomas Webb, 5 and 3 years old respectively, were Catherine's children, sweet and innocent in the way that only children can be, unaware that their comfortable life was built on the suffering of others. Rosa had watched all of these children grow up, had fed them when they were hungry, had comforted them when they cried, had seen them take their first steps and speak their first words. She had also watched them gradually absorb the attitudes of their parents, had seen the moment when they stopped seeing her as a person and began treating her as a servant. The transformation was always heartbreaking, the gradual realization that even the kindest white child would eventually learn to look through her as if she were invisible. But it was Rosa's own children who occupied her thoughts during the long hours she spent cooking for the Thornfield family. Sarah, now 16, worked as a house servant in the main mansion, cleaning rooms and serving meals under the constant supervision of Vivian Thornfield. Sarah was beautiful and intelligent, qualities that made Rosa worry constantly about her daughter's safety. She had seen too many young enslaved women disappear into the private quarters of white men, had watched mothers weep over daughters who had no legal protection against rape or abuse.
David, 12 years old, worked in the stables, caring for the family's horses. He was a bright boy who would somehow learn to read, despite laws forbidding the education of enslaved people. And Rosa lived in constant fear that his intelligence would be discovered and punished. She had heard stories of enslaved children being sold away from their families for the crime of literacy. And she knew that David's curiosity about the wider world made him vulnerable to accusations of planning escape or rebellion. Moses, Rosa's husband, worked as the plantation blacksmith, a skilled position that provided some protection from the worst abuses of slavery. The Thornfields valued his ability to make and repair the tools essential to plantation operations, and his work was too important to risk losing him to punishment or sale. But Moses was also a man of deep moral conviction who struggled daily with the knowledge that his skills were being used to maintain a system that enslaved his own family. He had fashioned the chains that held other human beings in bondage, had repaired the tools used to punish those who tried to escape, had created the metal implements that made cotton production possible. The relationship between Rosa and the Thornfield family had been complicated by 18 years of daily interactions that were simultaneously intimate and dehumanizing. She knew their favorite foods, their eating habits, their digestive problems, their secret indulgences. She had cooked for their celebrations and their sorrows, had prepared meals for births and deaths, had created elaborate feasts for political gatherings where powerful men made decisions about the future of slavery. Rosa understood the family dynamics better than they understood themselves, knew which family members harbored resentments against others, who was falling out of favor, who might be vulnerable to manipulation. But this intimate knowledge came at a terrible cost. Rosa was expected to be available whenever the family needed her, regardless of her own exhaustion or illness. She had worked through pregnancies that left her weak and nauseated, had cooked elaborate meals while burning with fever, had prepared food with hands injured from kitchen accidents because stopping work was not an option. She had missed important moments in her children's lives because the Thornfields' needs always came first, had been separated from her family during emergencies because her duty to the white family superseded her responsibilities as a mother. The psychological toll of this existence was something Rosa carried silently, the way enslaved people learned to carry all their pain. She had perfected the art of emotional invisibility, of being present in body while keeping her thoughts and feelings carefully hidden. She had learned to smile while being insulted, to thank white people for abuse, to express gratitude for the basic necessities of life as if they were generous gifts rather than minimal requirements for human survival. Easter Sunday, 1859, was planned as the grandest celebration in Riverside Manor's history. The entire extended family would gather for the first time in 3 years, a reunion designed to show the world that the Thornfields remained united and powerful despite the growing political tensions threatening their way of life. Elias, despite his declining health, had insisted on hosting one final gathering where he could see all 4 generations together, where he could pass down family stories and traditions to great-grandchildren who might be the last generation to enjoy the wealth and privilege that slavery had made possible. The menu Rosa was expected to prepare reflected both the family's wealth and their connection to Southern culinary traditions. Ham glazed with honey and brown sugar, turkey stuffed with cornbread and pecans, fried chicken that required hours of careful preparation, fish fresh from Mobile Bay, vegetables from the plantation's gardens, bread and biscuits made from the finest flour, desserts that showcased every skill Rosa had developed over 2 decades of cooking. The meal was designed to last for hours, a celebration of abundance that would reinforce the family's sense of prosperity and security. For Rosa, the Easter feast represented the culmination of a week of intensive preparation that left her exhausted and resentful. She had worked 16-hour days planning menus, ordering supplies, preparing ingredients,
coordinating with other enslaved workers who would help serve the meal. She had endured constant criticism from Vivian Thornfield, who inspected every detail and found fault with preparations that would have impressed professional chefs in New Orleans or Mobile. She had watched her own children go hungry while she prepared delicacies for white people who would consume more food in one meal than her family saw in a week. The breaking point came 3 days before Easter, during a conversation Rosa was never meant to overhear. She had been working in the kitchen house, preparing vegetables for the feast, when voices from the main house carried across the covered walkway. Marcus and Benjamin were discussing plantation finances, reviewing accounts and making plans for the coming year. Rosa had learned to pay attention to these conversations because they often revealed information that affected the enslaved community, news about potential sales or purchases, changes in work assignments, decisions that could destroy families or create new opportunities for survival. What she heard that afternoon made her hands freeze in the middle of chopping onions, made her heart stop beating for a moment before resuming with a rhythm that felt like drum beats announcing war. Benjamin was arguing that the plantation needed to reduce expenses by selling older enslaved workers who were no longer productive enough to justify their maintenance costs. He had prepared a list of people he considered expendable, and Rosa heard her husband's name spoken with the casual indifference reserved for discussing the disposal of worn-out equipment. Moses was 42 years old, still strong and skilled, but Benjamin had decided that hiring a younger blacksmith would be more cost-effective in the long run. He was planning to sell Moses to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the brutal working conditions meant that enslaved people rarely lived more than a few years. The sale would separate Rosa from her husband permanently, would leave her children without a father, would destroy the family that had somehow managed to stay together despite the constant threats inherent in their enslaved status. But even worse was Benjamin's casual mention of Rosa's own future. At 35, she was considered past the prime age for childbearing, which reduced her value in the eyes of people who calculated human worth based on reproductive potential. Benjamin suggested that Rosa might be sold along with Moses, leaving Sarah and David to be raised by other enslaved families or, more likely, to be sold separately to plantations where they would disappear into the anonymous mass of enslaved children torn from their parents. The conversation continued, but Rosa had stopped listening. She stood in the kitchen house holding a knife in hands that trembled with rage so pure it felt like religious revelation. For 18 years, she had endured every humiliation, every cruelty, every casual dismissal of her humanity, because she believed that compliance was the only way to protect her family. She had convinced herself that being a valuable cook would provide some security, that demonstrating loyalty and skill would earn enough respect to keep her children safe. The realization that none of it mattered, that her family could be destroyed on a whim to save money, shattered every illusion she had maintained about the possibility of survival within the system that enslaved them. That night, Rosa lay awake beside Moses, listening to his steady breathing and wondering if she should tell him what she had overheard. She imagined the conversation, pictured his face as she explained that their time together was ending, that their children would be orphaned, that everything they had worked to build was about to be torn apart for the convenience of people who had never considered them human. She thought about escape, about gathering the children and fleeing into the night, but she knew that runaway slaves rarely made it to freedom, that capture meant punishment worse than death, that failed escape attempts often resulted in families being sold immediately to the most brutal plantations in the Deep South. As dawn approached, Rosa made a decision that would echo through history. If her family was going to be destroyed anyway, if compliance and loyalty offered no protection, then perhaps it was time to stop playing by rules that were designed to ensure her defeat. She thought about the white azaleas blooming in the formal garden, remembered conversations with Aunt Hattie about plants that could heal and plants that could kill, recalled stories of enslaved people who had found ways to fight back against depression that seemed absolute. The idea that formed in Rosa's mind that morning was terrible in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. If Benjamin Thornfield wanted to calculate the value of human lives, perhaps it was time for him to learn that some calculations could work in reverse. If the Thornfield family saw enslaved people as expendable, perhaps they needed to discover what it felt like to be expendable themselves. Rosa Williams, who had spent 18 years cooking meals to nourish the family that owned her, began planning a different kind of feast for Easter Sunday. The morning air in Mobile carried the weight of spring rain and the promise of storms to come when Rosa Williams made her way to the formal gardens behind Riverside Manor. The sun had barely risen above the Alabama tree line, casting long shadows across manicured lawns that stretched from the main house to the river's edge. In the distance, she could hear the gentle lapping of water against the dock where Thornfield cotton was loaded onto steamboats bound for New Orleans and beyond. The sound had always reminded her of freedom, of places where people like her might walk without chains. But on this particular morning, it sounded more like a funeral dirge for dreams that would never be realized. The gardens at Riverside Manor were Vivian Thornfield's pride, a testament to refined Southern taste that had taken years to establish and required constant maintenance from enslaved workers who understood that a single wilted flower could result in punishment. Formal pathways lined with crushed oyster shells wound between carefully planned beds of seasonal blooms, each section designed to provide color and fragrance to route the growing season. Camellia bushes stood sentinel near the house, their waxy blooms providing winter interest when other plants lay dormant. Climbing roses would soon cover arbors and trellises, creating romantic alcoves where the family could sit and pretend their wealth wasn't built on human misery. But it was the white azaleas that drew Rosa's attention on this gray morning, their pristine blooms clustered along the pathway leading to the family chapel where Easter services would be held in 3 days. The shrubs had been planted
When the house was built, carefully selected for their ability to thrive in Alabama's humid climate and their spectacular spring display. Each bush stood 4 feet high and equally wide, covered with flowers so pure and white they seemed to glow in the pre-dawn light. To most observers, they were simply beautiful ornamental plants, evidence of the Thornfield family's commitment to creating a paradise on earth for themselves and their descendants. Rosa knew better. She had spent enough time listening to Aunt Hattie's stories about plant medicine to understand that beauty often concealed danger, that the most deadly poisons frequently came disguised as innocent flowers. The white azaleas blooming so abundantly in the Thornfield garden contained granulotoxins, compounds that could disrupt the human nervous system with devastating efficiency. In small doses, the toxins might cause mild stomach upset. In larger quantities, they could trigger cardiac arrhythmia, respiratory failure, and death. The knowledge had been passed down through generations of enslaved people who had learned to survive by understanding every resource available to them, including those that could be used as weapons when all other options had been exhausted. The conversation that had changed everything occurred 2 nights earlier, not in the kitchen house where Rosa usually worked, but in the quiet space behind the slave quarters where the older women gathered each evening to share news and wisdom. Aunt Hattie, at 68 years old, was the unofficial keeper of traditional knowledge for the enslaved community at Riverside Manor. She had been born in South Carolina and brought to Alabama as a young woman, carrying with her the plant lore her grandmother had learned in Africa before being stolen across the ocean. Her knowledge encompassed healing herbs and medicinal roots, but also extended to plants that could bring harm to those who consumed them unwisely. The gathering that night included Mary, the young woman who worked in the laundry and had recently given birth to a son she feared would be sold away from her before his first birthday. Old Pete was there too, the gardener whose intimate knowledge of every plant on the plantation made him invaluable to the family, despite his advancing age.
Jacob, the overseer's assistant, sat slightly apart from the others, his position making him simultaneously part of the enslaved community and separated from it by the responsibilities that came with his trusted status. Rosa herself rarely attended these informal meetings, her duties in the kitchen keeping her busy long after others had finished their work for the day. The conversation had started with Mary's fears about her infant son, her desperate questions about whether there might be somewhere safe to hide a baby if slave traders came to the plantation. The discussion gradually expanded to encompass the broader fears that haunted every enslaved family, the constant awareness that their lives could be disrupted or destroyed at any moment by the economic needs or personal whims of the people who owned them. Someone mentioned rumors of increased slave sales in the county, stories of families being separated to pay gambling debts or finance new business ventures. It was in this context that Aunt Hattie began speaking about resistance, about the ways enslaved people had fought back throughout history when legal protections didn't exist and physical confrontation was impossible. She spoke carefully, aware that even trusted gatherings could be dangerous if the wrong words reached the wrong ears. Her stories were framed as historical accounts, tales of things that had happened in other places and other times, but everyone understood the deeper implications of what she was sharing. She told them about enslaved cooks in Virginia who had used their access to white families' food to settle scores and protect their communities. She described plant medicines that could cure illnesses white doctors couldn't treat, but also mentioned the darker side of botanical knowledge, the understanding that the same plants which healed could also harm. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she spoke about the white azaleas blooming throughout the South, beautiful flowers that carried death in their petals for those who knew how to extract and concentrate their natural toxins. The old woman wasn't advocating violence, wasn't encouraging anyone to take dangerous actions that would bring retribution down on the entire community. She was simply sharing knowledge, preserving information that might someday prove useful for survival. But as Rosa listened to descriptions of how azalea flowers could be dried and ground into powder, how the resulting substance could be mixed into food without detection, how the effects would manifest hours after consumption, she felt something cold and determined settling in her chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a deep well. The technical details Aunt Hattie shared were precise enough to be useful, but general enough to avoid direct incrimination. She explained that granatoxins worked by disrupting sodium channels in nerve cells, causing the kind of cardiac and neurological symptoms that could easily be mistaken for food poisoning or natural illness. She mentioned that the concentration of toxins varied between different parts of the plant, with flowers containing the highest levels during peak blooming season. She noted that drying and grinding the petals would concentrate the active compounds while making them easier to incorporate into prepared foods. Most importantly, she emphasized the delayed onset of symptoms, which could provide crucial time for someone to establish an alibi and avoid immediate suspicion. Unlike some plant poisons that worked within minutes, azalea toxins typically took several hours to manifest their full effects. This delay meant that food prepared in the morning might not show its deadly properties until evening, creating confusion about timing and sources that could complicate any investigation. Rosa absorbed every word with the intensity of someone studying for the most important examination of her life. She had always been a quick learner, someone who could master new recipes after seeing them demonstrated once, who could adapt techniques to work with whatever ingredients were available. The skills that had made her an exceptional cook were exactly what she needed to become something else entirely, something that could fight back against a system that had never offered her family any path to safety or security. The conversation eventually moved on to other topics, but Rosa's mind remained fixed on the possibilities Aunt Hattie had revealed. She thought about the Easter dinner she would be preparing in 3 days, about the elaborate meal that would bring all 4 generations of the Thornfield family together around a single table. She considered the logistics
of incorporating azalea powder into dishes without detection, the challenge of ensuring that only the intended targets would consume the poisoned food, the need to protect innocent servants who might be blamed for any tragedy that occurred. As the gathering dispersed and enslaved workers returned to their cabins for a few hours of sleep before another day of labor began, Rosa felt herself changing in ways that went deeper than simple anger or desperation. The woman who had spent 18 years perfecting the art of invisible compliance was discovering reserves of cold calculation she hadn't known she possessed. The cook who had devoted her life to nourishing the family that owned her was beginning to plan their destruction with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to preparing their favorite meals. The next morning brought new challenges as Easter preparations intensified throughout Riverside Manor. Rosa found herself coordinating with a dozen other enslaved workers who would help prepare and serve the feast, each person responsible for specific tasks that would contribute to the overall success of the celebration. She had to maintain her usual demeanor of careful competence while her mind worked through the logistics of incorporating poison into the meal without arousing suspicion or endangering innocent people. The menu for Easter Sunday had been planned weeks in advance, a showcase of Southern cuisine that would reinforce the Thornfield family's reputation for hospitality and refinement. The centerpiece would be a massive ham, glazed with honey, brown sugar, and spices, surrounded by roasted vegetables from the plantation's gardens. Turkey stuffed with cornbread dressing would provide an alternative to the ham, while fried chicken offered a more casual option for the younger family members. Fresh fish from Mobile Bay would be prepared in multiple ways, some fried in cornmeal batter and others baked with herbs and lemon. Side dishes would include rice pilaf, creamed corn, green beans cooked with bacon, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, and fresh bread baked in quantities sufficient to feed the extended family and their guests. Desserts would showcase Rosa's skills with pastry and confection, including coconut cake, pecan pie, bread pudding with whiskey sauce, and hand-churned ice cream flavored with vanilla beans imported from the Caribbean. Each dish required hours of preparation, careful timing to ensure everything reached the table at the proper temperature, and coordination between kitchen staff to manage the complexity of cooking multiple items simultaneously. Rosa had orchestrated similar feasts many times before, but never while simultaneously planning to transform the meal into an instrument of mass murder. The mental effort of maintaining normal behavior while calculating dosages and delivery methods exhausted her in ways that simple physical labor never had. The challenge of targeting only the Thornfield family while protecting enslaved workers and innocent guests required careful consideration of eating patterns and food distribution. Rosa knew that the family typically served themselves first at formal dinners, taking the choicest portions from serving dishes before allowing servants to eat leftovers in the kitchen. She also understood the hierarchy that determined who sat where at the table, who received which dishes, and how portions were allocated based on age and status within the family. Her plan began to focus on items that would be consumed exclusively by family members, dishes that servants wouldn't have access to until after the formal meal had concluded. The honey glaze for the ham offered one possibility, since the sweetened coating would be carved away with the meat and wouldn't be available to kitchen staff. Certain side dishes prepared in small quantities for the formal table could be treated differently from larger batches prepared for servant consumption. Most promising of all was the cornbread dressing for the turkey, a complex mixture of ingredients that could easily conceal additional components without affecting taste or appearance. The white azaleas she had studied in the garden would need to be harvested carefully, during hours when her absence from the kitchen wouldn't be noticed and her presence in the garden wouldn't attract attention. Old Pete's daily routine provided the perfect cover, since his early morning work in the flower beds would explain why someone might be seen near the ornamental plantings at dawn. Rosa could time her gathering to coincide with his schedule, appearing to help with garden maintenance while actually collecting the materials she needed for her deadly purpose. Processing the azalea flowers would require privacy and equipment that wouldn't be missed from the kitchen. She would need to dry the petals thoroughly to concentrate their toxins, then grind them into a fine powder that could be incorporated into food without detection.
The mortar and pestle she used for grinding spices would serve this purpose, though she would need to clean it meticulously afterward to avoid accidental poisoning of innocent people. Timing would be critical, since the processed azalea powder would need to be prepared close to the time of use to maintain its potency. The psychological transformation Rosa experienced during these days of preparation was as profound as the practical planning she undertook. She found herself observing the Thornfield family with new eyes, studying their habits and vulnerabilities with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. Benjamin's arrogant confidence in his own superiority suddenly seemed like dangerous overconfidence. Marcus's casual cruelty toward enslaved workers revealed itself as the weakness of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Even the children, innocent as they were of personal wrongdoing, appeared to her now as future oppressors who would grow up to perpetuate the system that enslaved her family.
Undertones as she imagined their final meal, their last moments of blissful ignorance before the azalea toxins began their deadly work. The casual way they discussed selling her husband, the indifferent planning for her own disposal, the complete absence of recognition that she was a human being with feelings and rights, all of it fueled the cold fire burning in her chest. Vivian Thornfield's constant criticism of Easter preparations took on a darkly ironic quality as Rosa realized she was planning the woman's death while enduring lectures about proper seasoning and presentation. Marcus's complaints about the cost of feeding enslaved families became even more infuriating when Rosa considered that he was willing to destroy those families to save money while spending lavishly on a feast that would celebrate his own superiority. The children's excited chatter about Easter egg hunts and special treats felt like mockery when Rosa understood that their privilege was built on the systematic destruction of people like her own children. By the evening before Easter Sunday, Rosa had made all her preparations. The azalea petals had been harvested, dried, and ground into a fine white powder that looked remarkably similar to the cornstarch and flour she used in everyday cooking. The portion sizes had been calculated based on body weight and anticipated consumption patterns, with extra amounts prepared to ensure effectiveness, despite the variables involved in dosing multiple people simultaneously. The incorporation method had been selected and rehearsed, though only with harmless substitutes that wouldn't reveal her intentions if discovered. The kitchen house stood ready for the most elaborate meal in Riverside Manor's history, with ingredients arranged and equipment prepared for hours of intensive cooking that would begin before dawn on Easter morning. Rosa had supervised the preparation of serving dishes, the arrangement of dining room furniture, the selection of crystal and china that would grace the family's final feast. Every detail had been considered and planned, from the timing of individual courses to the coordination of multiple cooking processes that would culminate in a meal worthy of the Thornfield family's reputation for hospitality. But beneath the familiar routine of feast preparation lay a deeper purpose that transformed Rosa's kitchen work into something resembling a religious ritual. She was preparing not just a meal, but a reckoning. Not just nourishment, but justice served on bone china plates imported from England. The woman who had spent 18 years cooking to preserve the lives and comfort of her oppressors was finally ready to cook for a different purpose entirely, to use her skills and knowledge to balance scales that had been weighted against her people for generations. As Rosa finally fell asleep on the night before Easter Sunday, her last conscious thought was of her children sleeping safely in their cabin, unaware that their mother was about to commit an act that would either liberate them or destroy them all. The morning would bring the most important cooking she had ever done, the preparation of a meal that would transform her from victim to executioner, from slave to the architect of her own terrible form of freedom. The azalea powder waited in its small container, white and innocent as the flowers from which it came, ready to carry death disguised as Southern hospitality to the table of Alabama's most powerful family. Easter Sunday dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the Alabama air feel thick enough to swim through. Rosa Williams rose before the first rooster crowed, her body moving with mechanical precision despite having slept barely 3 hours.
The kitchen house remained dark except for the orange glow from banked coals in the main fireplace, embers that had been carefully maintained through the night to provide the foundation for the cooking fires that would soon consume most of the day. The familiar sense of wood smoke and cold ash filled her nostrils as she began the methodical process of building up the fires needed to prepare what would become the most infamous meal in Alabama history. The schedule Rosa had perfected over 18 years of cooking elaborate feasts called for starting the ham at 4 in the morning, allowing 12 hours for the slow roasting that would produce meat tender enough to cut with a fork. The massive piece of pork, nearly 20 pounds of carefully cured meat from the plantation smokehouse, required constant attention as it cooked over carefully controlled heat. The honey glaze that would give the ham its golden exterior and distinctive flavor wouldn't be applied until the final hour of cooking, creating the perfect opportunity to incorporate the azalea powder without detection. Working by candlelight in the pre-dawn darkness, Rosa began assembling the ingredients for the cornbread dressing that would stuff the turkey and provide one of the meal's most anticipated side dishes. The recipe called for day-old cornbread crumbled by hand, mixed with chopped celery, onions, and sage from the herb garden. Chicken stock made from bones and scraps would bind the mixture together, while beaten eggs would help it hold its shape during the long baking process. The preparation required Rosa to work with her hands, mixing and kneading the dressing until it reached the proper consistency, creating multiple opportunities to incorporate her deadly addition without anyone noticing the extra ingredient. The small container holding the processed azalea powder sat on the preparation table beside other spice containers, looking perfectly innocent among the familiar bottles and jars that Rosa used in her daily cooking. The white powder resembled cornstarch so closely that even someone familiar with kitchen ingredients would have difficulty distinguishing between them. Rosa had divided the poison into carefully measured portions, calculating dosages based on body weight of each family member and the amount of food they typically consumed during formal dinners. As the morning progressed and other kitchen staff began arriving to help with the massive cooking undertaking, Rosa felt her awareness heightening to an almost supernatural degree. Every sound seemed amplified, from the crackling of wood burning to the distant sound of church bells calling Mobile's white citizens to Easter services. Every scent became more pronounced, the competing aromas of roasting meat, baking bread, and blooming flowers creating a complex bouquet that seemed to underscore the gravity of what she was about to accomplish. Sarah arrived at 6 o'clock, as she did every morning, to begin her duties as a house servant. Rosa watched her 16-year-old daughter move through the kitchen with the grace and efficiency that had made her valuable to the Thornfield family, noting how Sarah's beauty was beginning to attract attention from white men
who saw her as property to be used rather than a person to be respected. The knowledge that Benjamin Thornfield was planning to sell Sarah along with the rest of the family made Rosa's hands shake with renewed fury as she continued preparing the meal that would solve their problems permanently. David appeared shortly afterward, having finished his dawn chores in the stables, ready to help with whatever tasks his mother might assign him. At 12 years old, he possessed the kind of quick intelligence that made him both valuable and dangerous in a system that preferred its slaves ignorant and compliant. Rosa had taught him to read in secret, recognizing that education might provide opportunities for survival that strengthened compliance could not. Now she watched him carry water and firewood with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all his work, wondering if he would understand someday why she had chosen this particular path to protect his future. The turkey required different preparation techniques than the ham, needing to be cleaned thoroughly and stuffed with the cornbread dressing that Rosa had prepared in the darkness before dawn. The large bird, nearly 15 pounds of domestic turkey raised in the plantation's poultry yard, would take most of the day to roast properly. Rosa worked methodically, spooning the dressing mixture into the turkey's cavity and sewing the opening closed with kitchen twine. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, while her mind calculated timing and contingencies, ensuring that every aspect of the meal would be ready simultaneously despite the different cooking requirements of individual dishes. The bread preparation began at 8 o'clock, with Rosa mixing flour, lard, and buttermilk into dough that would be shaped into loaves and rolls.
The wheat flour, purchased from a mill in Mobile at considerable expense, represented the kind of luxury that the Thornfield family took for granted while their enslaved workers ate cornbread made from grain ground on the plantation. Rosa kneaded the dough with more force than necessary, channeling her anger into the physical labor while maintaining the calm exterior that had kept her safe for nearly 2 decades. As the morning wore on, Rosa coordinated with other enslaved workers who had been assigned to help with the Easter feast preparation. Mary arrived from the laundry to help with vegetable preparation, her infant son strapped to her back in a cloth sling that allowed her to work while keeping him close. Old Pete brought fresh vegetables from the garden, carrots and onions and potatoes that would be roasted alongside the ham, their earthy flavors providing contrast to the sweet glaze that would carry death to the Thornfield table. The coordination required to manage multiple cooking processes simultaneously had always been one of Rosa's greatest skills, the ability to keep track of various dishes while ensuring that everything reached completion at the proper time. Today, that skill took on deadly importance, as she calculated not just cooking times but also the onset periods for azalea poisoning, ensuring that the toxic effects would not manifest until after the meal had been consumed and she had established her alibi by cleaning dishes in the kitchen. The church bells of Mobile began ringing at 10 o'clock, calling the city's white population to Easter services that would celebrate resurrection and eternal life while ignoring the systematic destruction of human dignity that funded their comfortable lifestyles. The Thornfield family would attend the early service at their own chapel before returning home for the elaborate dinner that had been planned for months. Rosa listened to the bells and thought about justice, about the biblical concepts of judgment and retribution that white ministers preached without applying to their own treatment of enslaved people. The final preparations began at 11 o'clock as Rosa started incorporating the azalea powder into specific dishes while maintaining the appearance of normal cooking activity. The honey glaze for the ham received its deadly addition as Rosa brushed the sweet mixture across the meat's surface, the graninoxins invisible among the sugar and spices that would create the dish's signature flavor. The cornbread dressing got its own dose of poison mixed carefully into the final batch before being spooned into the turkey cavity, ensuring even distribution throughout the stuffing that would be carved and served to individual family members. The side dishes that would accompany the main courses required different approaches to poisoning, since Rosa needed to ensure that only the Thornfield family would consume the treated food while protecting the enslaved workers who would eat leftovers in the kitchen after the formal meal concluded. The creamed corn received a lighter dose of azalea powder mixed into the butter and cream that gave the dish its rich texture. The sweet potatoes were prepared with a special glaze reserved for the family table, while identical dishes prepared for servant consumption remained untainted. As noon approached and the family returned from Easter services, Rosa felt time beginning to compress around her in ways that made every minute feel simultaneously endless and instantaneous. The elaborate preparations that had consumed her entire morning were nearly complete, with each dish perfectly timed to reach the table at the moment of optimal flavor and temperature. The sounds of the family's return filtered through the kitchen house windows as carriages rolled up the circular drive and voices called greetings across the formal gardens where white azaleas bloomed in innocent splendor. The final hour before serving required Rosa to coordinate with house servants who would carry dishes from the kitchen to the dining room, ensuring proper presentation while maintaining the temperatures that would preserve both flavor and toxicity. Mary moved between kitchen and dining room, arranging crystal glasses and silver utensils with the precision that Vivian Thornfield demanded for formal occasions. David helped carry serving platters, his young face serious with concentration as he balanced heavy dishes without spilling or dropping anything that might result in punishment. The dining room at Riverside Manor had been transformed for the Easter celebration, with the family's finest china and crystal arranged on a table extended with additional leaves to accommodate all 4 generations of Thornfields. Fresh flowers from the garden created centerpieces that complemented the formal place settings, while candles in silver holders provided elegant lighting despite the afternoon sunshine streaming through tall windows. The room represented everything the family valued about their position in Alabama society, a showcase of wealth and refinement that demonstrated their superiority over less fortunate neighbors. At exactly 1 o'clock, Rosa began the final service.
directing kitchen staff to carry the first courses to the dining room where the family had assembled in their Easter finery. Marcus Thornfield sat at the head of the table, resplendent in a black suit that emphasized his authority as master of the plantation. Vivian occupied the place of honor at his right, her silk dress the color of spring flowers providing elegant contrast to the dark wood of the dining room furniture. The children had been dressed in their finest clothes, little girls in white dresses with ribbons and boys in miniature versions of their father's formal wear. Old Elias presided from his wheelchair at the foot of the table, his aged body trembling slightly as he prepared to offer the blessing that would begin the meal. Despite his declining health, the family patriarch had insisted on saying grace over the Easter feast, recognizing that this might be his final opportunity to gather all 4 generations together for a celebration of their continued prosperity and power. His voice, weakened by age but still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, began the prayer that would sanctify their final meal. The blessing thanked God for the abundance spread before them, for the prosperity that allowed them to maintain their privileged lifestyle, and for the natural order that placed them above those who served them. Elias spoke in gratitude for their many blessings without acknowledging that those blessings had been purchased with the systematic exploitation of human beings who were forbidden to claim their own humanity. The irony of offering thanks for abundance while planning to sell the people who had created that abundance seemed lost on a family that had never questioned the moral foundations of their wealth. Rosa stood in the kitchen house, watching through windows as the family began consuming their poisoned feast with the satisfaction of people who had never doubted their right to luxury and comfort. The ham was carved with ceremony, thick slices of glazed meat distributed according to age and status within the family hierarchy. The cornbread dressing was spooned from the turkey cavity, its deadly contents invisible among the familiar flavors of sage and celery that had made it a family favorite for generations. Side dishes were passed around the table with elaborate courtesy, each family member taking portions sized according to their appetites and preferences. The conversation at the table covered familiar topics, political developments that might affect cotton prices, social events planned for the coming season, family news from relatives in Montgomery and Mobile. The children chattered about their Easter egg hunt planned for after dinner, while adults discussed business matters with the casual confidence of people who believed their prosperity was both permanent and deserved. None of them showed any awareness that they were consuming their own deaths with every bite of Rosa's carefully prepared meal. The delayed action of azalea toxins meant that symptoms would not manifest for several hours, giving Rosa time to establish her alibi by cleaning dishes and returning kitchen equipment to its normal state. She worked methodically, washing pots and pans while keeping track of the time and calculating when the first signs of poisoning would begin to appear. The gray toxins needed time to be absorbed through the digestive system and begin disrupting nervous system function, creating the window of apparent normalcy that would make the subsequent chaos more shocking and confusing. By 3 o'clock, the formal dinner had concluded with the family expressing satisfaction at Rosa's culinary achievements, praising dishes that had met their exacting standards for flavor and presentation. The children were released to play in the gardens while adults retired to the parlor for coffee and conversation that would continue until the deadly effects of their meal began to manifest. Rosa continued her cleaning duties, maintaining the same calm efficiency that had characterized her work for 18 years, while internally counting down to the moment when her long-planned revenge would finally begin. The first symptoms appeared at 4:30. Beginning with little Thomas Webb, the 3-year-old who had consumed a smaller portion of poisoned food but whose lower body weight made him more susceptible to toxic effects. The child began complaining of stomach pain, crying in his mother's arms as nausea and cramping overwhelmed his small body. Catherine initially attributed his distress to overindulgence at the elaborate dinner, but his condition quickly worsened beyond anything that could be explained by simple overeating. Within minutes, other family members began experiencing similar symptoms as the azalea toxins reached effective concentrations in their bloodstreams. Old Elias was the next to succumb, his aged body less able to process the poison that was beginning to disrupt his already fragile cardiac system.
Marcus Thornfield, despite his apparent health and strength, found himself struggling with irregular heartbeat and difficulty breathing as the gray toxins interfered with his nervous system's ability to maintain normal physiological functions. The progression of symptoms followed the pattern that Aunt Hattie had described during her evening lecture about plant poisons, beginning with gastrointestinal distress before advancing to more serious neurological and cardiac effects. Vomiting and diarrhea gave way to confusion and disorientation as the toxins crossed the blood-brain barrier and began affecting cognitive function. Heart rhythms became increasingly erratic, causing circulation problems that manifested as pale skin, cold extremities, and the kind of respiratory distress that indicated approaching cardiovascular collapse. Dr. Henry Morrison, who had attended the dinner as a family friend and guest, found himself in the impossible position of trying to treat patients while experiencing the same symptoms that were killing them. His medical training allowed him to recognize the signs of systematic poisoning, but his knowledge of treatment options was limited by the primitive state of 1859 medicine and his own rapidly declining capacity to function as the toxins affected his judgment and motor skills. The chaos that engulfed Riverside Manor during those evening hours exceeded anything Rosa had imagined during her careful planning. Screams echoed through rooms that had previously known only genteel conversation and refined entertainment. Family members who had never experienced genuine fear found themselves facing death with no understanding of why they were dying or what could be done to save them. The children, most vulnerable to the poison's effects, suffered visibly as their small bodies struggled unsuccessfully to process toxins that would have challenged healthy adults. Rosa maintained her position in the kitchen house, cleaning dishes and preparing simple foods for enslaved workers who had not consumed any of the poisoned meal. Her behavior remained consistent with her normal duties, providing her with the alibi she needed while demonstrating the same calm efficiency that had characterized her work for nearly 2 decades. Anyone observing her would have seen nothing unusual in her demeanor, no indication that she was
responsible for the tragedy unfolding in the main house. By evening, 17 members of the Thornfield family lay dead in their Easter finery, their bodies arranged around tables still set with the finest china and crystal. 4 generations of Alabama's most powerful cotton dynasty had been eliminated in a single afternoon, victims of a cook's carefully calculated revenge, served with honey glaze and cornbread dressing. The meal that had been planned as a celebration of family unity and continued prosperity had become the instrument of their complete destruction. The investigation that followed would consume months and involve law enforcement officials from 3 counties, but it would never successfully identify Rosa as the perpetrator of the mass poisoning. The delayed onset of symptoms created confusion about timing that made it difficult to trace the source of the toxins. The sophisticated preparation of the azalea powder and its incorporation into multiple dishes demonstrated knowledge and planning that investigators couldn't conceive of attributing to an enslaved woman. The systematic elimination of an entire family seemed too complex and ambitious to be the work of someone they considered incapable of such elaborate criminal planning. Rosa's carefully maintained alibi held up under questioning, supported by multiple witnesses who had seen her cleaning dishes and performing normal kitchen duties during the critical hours when the poisoning occurred. Her apparent shock and horror at the family's deaths seemed genuine enough to investigators who had never learned to recognize the acting skills that enslaved people developed as survival tools. The possibility that the quiet, efficient cook who had served the family faithfully for 18 years might be capable of mass murder lay outside their ability to imagine or investigate. The legal proceedings that followed focused instead on theories of accidental poisoning, contaminated food supplies, or possible involvement by disgruntled former employees who might have had access to the kitchen during meal preparation. Several enslaved workers were questioned extensively and subjected to physical punishment designed to extract confessions, but none of them knew anything about Rosa's plans or methods. The investigation gradually lost momentum as authorities failed to develop evidence supporting any of their theories about how the tragedy had occurred. Within 6 months of the Easter Sunday massacre, Riverside Manor had been sold to settle the Thornfield family's debts, and the enslaved workers who had survived the investigation were dispersed to plantations throughout the Deep South. Rosa,
Sarah, David, and Moses were purchased by a cotton planter in Mississippi who knew nothing of their connection to the Mobile tragedy. The new owner saw them simply as experienced plantation workers whose skills would contribute to his own agricultural operations. Rosa's transformation from victim to executioner had achieved its immediate goal of preventing her family's separation, but it had also changed her in ways that would affect the rest of her life. The woman who had spent 18 years perfecting the art of invisible compliance had discovered capacities for deception and violence that isolated her from normal human connection. The skills that had made her an effective instrument of revenge also made it impossible for her to form the relationships that might have provided healing from the trauma that had driven her to mass murder. The psychological cost of her actions became apparent during her remaining years in Mississippi, where Rosa continued working as a cook while struggling with nightmares and periods of disassociation that suggested profound mental distress. She had saved her family from separation only to sacrifice her own ability to experience joy, love, or peace. The children whose future she had protected through murder would grow up with a mother who had become emotionally unavailable, damaged by secrets she could never share and guilt she could never resolve. The legacy of Easter Sunday at Riverside Manor extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing how enslaved communities throughout the Deep South understood the possibilities and costs of resistance. Word of the mass poisoning spread through networks of communication that existed entirely outside official channels, carried by field hands who traveled between plantations and house servants who gathered at Sunday markets. The story became part of the hidden history that enslaved people preserved and transmitted, a reminder that even the most powerless individuals could sometimes strike back against their oppressors. But the story also served as a cautionary tale about the psychological price of violence, even violence committed in self-defense or protection of family. Rosa Williams had achieved a form of justice that the legal system would never have provided, but she had done so by destroying her own capacity for human connection and emotional healing. The woman who had spent 18 years cooking with love for her own family had learned to cook with hatred for others, and that knowledge had poisoned something essential in her own soul. The moral complexity of Rosa's story resists simple interpretation or judgment. She was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, someone driven to desperate measures by an evil system, and someone who chose to respond with evil of her own. The 17 people who died at her Easter table included children who bore no personal responsibility for the institution of slavery, family members who might have grown up to question or oppose the system that had enriched them, and individuals whose deaths accomplished nothing beyond satisfying Rosa's desire for revenge. Yet it's impossible to consider Rosa's actions without acknowledging the impossible situation that had driven her to such extremes. The system that enslaved her family had offered no legal protections, no appeals process, no hope of justice through legitimate channels. The choice between accepting the destruction of her family and fighting back through the only means available to her was not really a choice at all, but rather a test of how much suffering a human being could endure before being driven beyond the boundaries of moral behavior. The kitchen house at Riverside Manor was demolished within a year of the tragedy, burned down by new owners who wanted no reminders of the horror that had occurred there. But the memory of Rosa Williams and her deadly Easter feast lived on in stories passed down through generations of people who understood that sometimes the only justice available comes from unexpected sources, served by hands that have learned to cook with ingredients more bitter than any spice. The woman who had spent 18 years feeding her oppressors had finally found a way to satisfy her own hunger for something that no amount of compliance or patience could have provided. The price of that satisfaction would echo through the remaining years of her life, a reminder that even justified revenge carries costs that extend far beyond its immediate targets. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.